Hi there, I'm Sarah and today I'm going to show you how to sew in a set-in sleeve, which is a sleeve that is a smooth cap with no gathers, and it has a distinct armhole like a traditional sleeve would be. I am a 100,000,000% fan of set-in sleeves. I feel like those garments always fit better, and it's easy, and it's a better fitting garment and better looking garment when you use a set-in sleeve. And I know that when you first start going into setting them in or sewing them in, it can be a little confusing. Why is the sleeve so much bigger than the armhole? Well, that's so that when you're wearing the sleeve, that you have some ease across this fullness right here of your arm, which I like to call the gush. So you need this extra right here in the cap to go across right here because it is a cylinder. Now if you want to get straight to the sewing, skip ahead a little bit. I'm just going to talk a little bit about set-in sleeves. So typically there's a front and a back to the sleeve. Double notches almost always mean the back, single is the front. And this little notch right here is not the midway point, but rather the shoulder seam of the shirt. So it lines up to that shoulder seam right there. It's usually a 1/4 of an inch forward of the middle of the sleeve. And unless you're doing a custom sleeve like mine, when I drafted my own, mine's a little bit different than that because of my own body fitting needs. So when you go to set in this sleeve here, when you're a beginner, it's very tempting to just cut off the extra to get that sleeve in there, but don't do that. Your sleeve, you won't be able to lift your arm up very well, it won't be very comfortable, and you'll be pretty unhappy with the overall garment after you spent all that time on it. So I'm going to show you a really easy way. Someone a very long time ago when I was newer to sewing showed me this trick, and I've used it ever since, and it always works. So get your sleeve ready, get your armhole ready. I have mine here. I've got my underarm sewn, and I do favor sewing the sleeve in with the underarm and the side seam already sewn on the garment. I know that people like to leave both these open and set the sleeve on and then sew up that underarm and side seam as one, but I do feel like the sleeve fits even better if you keep this a nice circle around your armhole. So, all right, are you ready? Get your pieces ready, and we will set this sleeve in 2 steps. No problem. Okay, we're ready to start. We're going to put in an easing stitch on the cap of the sleeve between the notches. It's not really a basting stitch, it's not really a gathering stitch. I like to call it an easing stitch because we're going to ease this fullness of the sleeve into the armhole with no gathers or tucks. And my sleeve here is about the max amount you're going to see in fullness. It's about 1.5 inches extra of a sleeve cap to the armhole. So you're going to go between the notches. Here's my front notch. Here's my double notches right there. You can barely see them. There they are. And my bobbin is going to be a contrast color, so I'll show you in the end. You're going to sew this just to the right of your seam allowance. So my seam allowance on this sleeve is a 1/2 inch. So I'm going to sew just to the right of that 1/2 inch seam allowance. Don't back stitch. Just go all the way around the cap. And you can sew it from the inside or the outside of the sleeve. It doesn't matter, whatever you want. You can go all the way down to that last notch. Don't backstitch. You can see there's my stitch. There's the bobbin. I don't typically sew with a contrast thread, but I figure this will be a little bit easier to see. All right, so now we're going to pull one side, so either your bobbin or your top thread, and you're going to pull a little bit all the way around the cap. So just pull a little bit. Yes, we're putting some gathers in there, but they're not going to stay there, I promise. It's going to be nice and flat. So make sure you pull all this fullness all the way, all these gathers, put them up at the top. Don't leave them down here. All right, so just get a bunch in there, just like that. Look at that. I have all that ruffling going on there. Now when I put in that basting stitch, I didn't change my stitch length. You're going to maintain the exact same stitch length you're going to be sewing the sleeve in. You don't really want a longer stitch like you would a gathering stitch or a basting stitch, because when you do a longer stitch, you do run the risk of adding some gathers. It's a little trickier. So I just keep the same stitch length that I usually sew the seam in. So I'm just gonna pull a bunch of gathers in there. And you want to do it evenly on each side. You can already see my sleeve is getting a nice little shape there. All right, so I'm going to take a little bit of this out. I want to make sure that that seam where I put that stitch in is actually flat. There's no gathers. The gathers are on either side of it. See that? There's a little spot right there. It's okay, we can adjust that as we sew. All right, so now our sleeve is ready. We've got our armhole. I wrote front and back on my bodice here just so you can see. And you're going to turn your shirt inside out. Line up the underarm seam and the side seam here, just like this. So here's my sleeve. Here is my side seam. Oops, this is my side seam. Oops, oops, oops. Here we go. Here's my side seam. Let's line those up. And however you did your seam treatment, you can press the seams to the back. You can press one to the front, one to the back, whatever you like. Okay, so now take that notch at the top of your sleeve and line it up to the shoulder. And we're actually going to pin from the sleeve side. We're going to sew with the sleeve up. I don't usually use pins when I put my sleeve in, so I'm just going to put in a couple, but you're welcome to put in a few more. And so now look at this. Look at the amount there. Now that looks like it's going to go in. I kind of pull it like this and I can see that I don't have any extra. This isn't too short or too long. You know, if it were looking a little bit more like this, I would know that that's just too, this is too loose back here and I need to pull some of those gathers out. Now you really want to add the fullness that you're creating to your sleeve. You really want to put that towards the top of your sleeve. Not down here where the curve is. You want to keep it towards the cap. It'll fit better and it'll feel better on the body. All right, so here we go. Now, you can do this with a serger or whatever you want. I do this with French seams. If you ever join my live stream, you'll see I do this with French seams all the time. This is not a French seam, so this isn't how I would do that. And now I start down here at the bottom of the underarm. And I sew at my seam allowance. Now see the threads of the easing stitch here, I like to kind of pull those out towards the seam allowance. All right, and so I didn't back stitch yet. All right, and so now we can see our gathering seam there, and I kind of line up these raw edges right here, just kind of keeping those lined up so I'm not pinning it all. And I'm going to sew just to the left of that easing stitch. Almost caught it there. You don't have to remove the easing stitch later. I like to, just because it's really satisfying. You don't have to, but you don't want to sew on it or to the right of it because it'll show on the outside of the garment. So just sew just to the left of it and keep arranging that armhole so that you don't catch any of the other bodice underneath. If you have a free arm, you might want to turn yours turn your sleeve so that it's going around the free arm of your machine. I don't have a free arm, I have a flatbed, so I have to do it this way. All right, so here we are, we're already at the top. This is like easy peasy, right? There's no tucks in there at all. I know it looks like it, but I'm just sewing just to the left of that stitch, and that stitch has no gathers in it. We just pulled up the excess by evenly distributing it along the sleeve cap. You can see I don't really have gathers down here. It's all at the top there. So we're coming around. Here's my thread ends again. One good thing about having the different color threads is that at least you can maintain which you pulled. Like I know for sure I pulled the blue thread on either end. That way I know I pulled the bobbin on both sides. You don't want to pull the top on one end and the bobbin on the other. They'll lock up. All right, so now here we are at the beginning. Backstitch and trim your threads. Do whatever you want to do here. And now let's look at our sleeve. Here we go. You can see that a massive amount of fullness in there. Those aren't tucks, they're just little wrinkles, you can see. And once you press it and get the seam allowance pointing toward the sleeve, all of that will go away. And so the last thing I like to do is pull out my easing stitch here. And because I put the end of the threads towards the raw edge of the seam, it's really easy to find it. Doesn't pull out as easily as a gathering stitch, but it will pull out. There we go. I get rid of it, and I feel like that also helps relax the sleeve and get rid of any wrinkles that might turn into tucks. And just kind of pull it and smooth it a little bit, because now you just kind of scrunched it all together to get rid of it. And then you're going to press your seam allowance toward the sleeve, and look at all that fullness we got in there. You want that little bump there. If you ever look at some of men's tailored clothes and really nice shirts, you'll see this little bump here. And so press that seam allowance toward it, and it'll help smooth it out even more. All right, good job. I know those are really tricky. I'll show you mine when it's all pressed. Okay, so once you give your sleeve a good pressing, you'll see that you still have that nice little curve there. And you have all the ease. And remember, the sleeve I used here is probably the most you'd ever see eased into it. Usually they're in the 1-inch range that you have to ease, so not quite as much. It'll be a little easier than this one, and it'll look a little better too. So there you go. That is the easy and quick way to sew in a set-in sleeve when you have all that ease that you need to fit into that armhole. Don't cut it off. Your sleeve will fit a lot better if you leave it in there and you sew it the right way. Good luck. Happy sewing.